Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Today my guest is very special. His name is John Nieuwenburg. He lives in Vancouver, Canada. He's a business coach, but this is not how I found him. I actually found him on TED, one of those wonderful TED Talks that sometimes we come across. And I was very touched by his story. So I contacted him and I invited him to be a guest on my podcast. And I'm so grateful you said yes, John. Thank you and welcome to my podcast on my YouTube channel.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to talk, first of all, I would like for you to tell us who you are. You are a business coach, award-winning. I know you come from a big family, one of those that we don't come across very often anymore.
No.
So tell us a little bit about you, your childhood, where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the center part of Canada. I was the eldest of 8 children. Which kind of casts you in a certain role when you're sort of cast as the elder or the eldest in the family. I'm hardwired to be a teacher. And it was Steve Jobs who said that we only can connect the dots going backwards. So I had a bit of an epiphany not very long ago that I've always been a teacher. And one of the dots that I was able to connect going back to my childhood was I was the one who would voluntarily go and get everyone's library cards. I'd take my bike and I'd go to the library. It was about 3 miles. I'd pick age and interest appropriate books for them. And 3 weeks later, when the books were due, I would repeat. No one had to ask me. That's just how I was wired. And today I still consider myself to be that person who goes and gives everybody books.
What were you like as a child?
Oh man, that's a hard question. Well, the first, I guess, well, a couple of things stand in mind. So the first day I went to school, 6 years old, 7 years old, 6, I came back that day with a note from my teacher that we were instructed to speak English at home from that point forward because I only knew Dutch. That was the only language I'd learned. And so I don't have much of a memory of that, but can only imagine that was a bit traumatic. I was a sort of mediocre student. I'm actually pretty smart, but not very good student, or at least in the conventional kind of sense of being a student. I started life or career in a menswear store. I was a sales guy in a store in Winnipeg, and over 17 years I lived in 10 cities in 12 years, and eventually landed up living in Toronto and was an executive in this company. And I didn't much like living in Toronto, so I got myself headhunted and came back to Vancouver, and been happy about that ever since.
I found you online, as I said in the beginning, and your TED Talk really moved me because it was powerful, it was brave, and I'm sure it was extremely difficult for you to do because the reason why you went there was to talk about your mental illness and also your suicide attempt. So I'm sure that was very hard. And I remember that I had to stop a few times when you stopped because you had to get some water and drink it because collect yourself. It was very moving because it was, we could tell that it was really from your heart. And I believe that was the first time that you publicly spoke about this.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
So can we start there, John? Can you tell us what was happening at the time that took you to that place?
The TED Talk or the suicide attempt?
The suicide attempt.
Yeah. I've had a few of these epiphanies. I mentioned one. Another epiphany is that it was only about a year or so ago that I connected the dots and recognized that my depression began with my mom's death in late 2009. At the same time, something in my business life occurred where I had another experience of loss and sort of a sense of direction, and it started a kind of a descent, kind of a
Mm-hmm.
vicious circle into a world where you get increasingly isolated, disconnected. At some level, I was able to intellectually knew what I needed to do, but in a real way, I just dropped out of life. Um, and I put on a bit of a face, and I don't think anybody really knew. Maybe they sensed it, but no one really knew. And as a self-employed person, that had a massive sort of whack on my well-being and financial well-being, and I got to a place where it was the end of the road, and felt like there was only one option, one possibility available to me, and I'd spent a month or so sort of calculating how to do it, and
Mm-hmm.
YouTube's got everything you'd ever want to know about how you might go about doing that kind of thing. And so I picked a day, and um, I spent, as I say in the talk, I spent about 4 hours. I couldn't find a suitable spot, and
Uh-huh.
um, so in the end, it was a very deliberate kind of choice you make.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
People say that suicide is kind of an act of courage, but I will argue with you that it was one of the most courageous things I've ever done, because, with very deliberate intention, you decide that's it, and
Mm-hmm.
you jump. And in my case, at the time, I was angry, but in my case, I was fortunate that the knot that I made didn't
Uh-huh.
hold, and it unraveled, and there I found myself on the floor, on the ground of the forest. And I, 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 I get the irony of this, but my neck was hurting so much that I um, couldn't feature or fashion the idea of making the rope again and putting it around my neck, because my neck was, so painful. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that
Yeah.
sounds kind of a paradox, but that's what happened.
Well, but it is a parallel to the pain that you were feeling inside. And as you said, you were putting on a mask.
Right.
Why was that? Why do you think you couldn't at that time talk to the people you loved and talk to you were married, right? You had
Yeah.
a partner.
Yeah.
And why do you think you couldn't do that? I mean, why
There's
why
no
was
one.
it so difficult?
There was no one I would trust that
Hmm.
much. I know that probably says something, but yeah, literally was. There was no one who I had that much confidence in.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
I In the work that I do, I'm often called on to be there for lots and lots of other people, to be there emotionally, to be there. Um, in fact, one of my clients about 2 weeks ago did me an enormous favor, and that I showed up in the meeting, and uncharacteristically, I said to him, "Gee, I'm not feeling terrific today," and he made me aware of a thing called compassion fatigue, which
Yes. Oh, I
which
know about that as a therapist.
yes, well, that's what
Yes.
I just discovered so I'm a pretty hard-nosed, driven kind of guy, but I'm also the kind of guy who soaks up a lot of other people's things, but I'm not very good at um, reciprocating that way. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard for me to be that honest and to trust someone enough to be able to express freely. Um, yeah, I don't.
Yeah, let's talk about the stigma, because I believe that that's one of the reasons why you came out and why you did
Mm,
the TED Talk and why you're
mm,
doing this conversation with me.
mm,
Why do you think that that played a part in, for example, you not seeking out for help? You say, well, maybe I didn't feel that there was anyone I could trust with that kind, sharing that kind of pain. But do you think
absolutely,
that self-stigma was playing a part too?
absolutely. Yeah.
In,
Um,
mm,
as I mentioned in the talk, I actually walked around with the idea that suicide is a criminal activity, that
mm-hmm,
you would be, sort of locked up in a ward or something, and kind of thinking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, kind of, um, that actually was the kind of framework that I had about
mm-hmm,
what might happen if I started actually talking to people about it. So I said at the beginning of this that I'm hardwired to be a teacher, and that instinct to be a teacher is what compelled me to do the TED Talk. That I had an experience, I had some insight, I felt like, and that I wanted to share that, and that actually was the driving and the motivation to do it. What I discovered is that it was amongst the most self-healing things I could have possibly have done.
Really?
The PowerPoint presentation that I used was open 22,000 minutes, which is 16 24-hour days. So in a 6-month space from November to May, that's how much effort, time I put into writing, thinking, rehearsing, preparing. And that was, in retrospect, it's not what I expected it to be, or I didn't anticipate that would happen, but it was the most cathartic thing I could have possibly done, as I had to come to grips with what I was thinking and how to make sense of it. So that's really what the compelling reason was to do the TED Talk. And at the time, I was very, very afraid that it would be very harmful to my career. I'm expected to be sort of a leading citizen and have a reputation. But oh, by the way, it's actually turned out to be the exact opposite. That as Brené Brown talks about, vulnerability is attractive to people. That's not what I expected. I didn't do it for that reason, but that's what it's turned out to be. That people are very much attracted or in awe, respect people that lay it out there.
And the people who are authentic.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and that was one of the things that when I was watching your TED Talk, I said, wow, he's a business coach. He's the guy who comes to companies, to small companies, to big businesses, and gives them solutions. So
Exactly.
he's supposed to have the answer for everything.
Yeah.
But he's a guy who had mental illness and couldn't really deal with it, couldn't seek for help when all these people are coming to him seeking for help. So I understand when you say that it was quite the opposite.
Yeah.
I see this happen all the time. People who are trying to come out in terms of having mental illness, and we see this with celebrities all the time because this is what connects us as human beings, right? It's not your profession that connects you with me, it's your emotions. It's what we have in common.
Yeah.
So tell me about that day. I was quite curious. You say I was afraid, and I was thinking, backstage, how was it for you to actually stand there and say, oh, I'm going to finally do this?
Yeah. Well, I'll share a couple of things. One of the things I've always wondered about is what happens to someone, say an Olympic ice dancer or an Olympic downhill skier, and they're at their event and they're about to go on the ice, and the next 2 minutes are going to define their life. How do they manage that? How do they cope? And what I always struggled with is they would be interviewed and they would always say, I just want to go have fun. How can that be? Like, you're lying. But what you asked me about being in the green room, and what I came to understand is being that prepared, 22,000 minutes, you're in a place where you just want to do it because you're so ready. So, but what happened is the day before, I was in a intellectual space. I'm in the green room and I've got time, and what do? You just rehearse again. And it was the first time I did 2 rehearsals, and it's the first time in both times where I got choked up emotionally. And so when it happened on stage, I could see it coming. I could feel it coming. It's like, oh no.
No. I'm going to cry again, even though I rehearsed this.
Yeah, so so that for me was a really kind of just an interesting thing that happened, that in the green room, I guess it finally sort of, became very, very real, and the emotion of it, and the appreciation that I felt for the people that helped me out afterwards.
Who did you share it with during the time when you were preparing the presentation? Did you share it with your family?
Not the presentation itself. They were
Mm,
aware that I was doing it. Many of the family were advising me strongly not to do it.
mm-hmm,
My spouse was very aware of how much energy I was putting into it. That
mm-hmm.
if I had a spare minute, and even if they weren't spare minutes, that's all I was thinking about in preparing that talk. Um, it probably took about a year or maybe 18 months afterwards. So from the period of around 2009 to 2012, 13 are kind of lost years for me,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that, I was just in a really dysfunctional place or unproductive kind of place.
Mm-hmm.
And even a year or more after the talk, I was still in that place. But once I got there, the last 5 years of my life have been the best they've ever been. Off the charts awesome. And
Wow.
I get that it's the paradox or irony of this is that I can't for the minute try to reimagine in my mind what was going on for me back at that time. It just feels so remote and distant, and um, uh, it's hard for me to recognize that I was that guy. That it just feels so. I'm in such a different place now.
Yes, but that brings so much hope, and I'm so glad you mentioned this, John, because my audience is composed mainly of people who are at risk for suicide, or,
Right.
or those who lost someone to
Yeah.
suicide. And when you are in that moment, you really believe that that's the only way out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and now that you're saying in hindsight, I cannot recognize myself, so that actually brings hope to those who are listening.
Yeah, I want people to know that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It
Mm-hmm,
doesn't feel that way. It didn't feel like that for me at the time. But today, in retrospect, it's unfathomable,
mm-hmm,
um, how that might have happened. And so, whatever you might be, your audience, whatever they might be experiencing, take it at least one person that it can get better, and it does.
mm-hmm. Can you tell me what helped you back then? You mentioned that you had this unexpected help from two
Yeah.
brothers,
So
I
two of my
believe, and your
brothers.
wife.
Yeah, when I came home that night from my attempt.
Mm-hmm,
My wife came home at about supper time, dinner time, and I'd been home for 5 hours or something like that. So she gets home and we're
mm-hmm.
sitting having dinner, and she's looking at me. Why is my shirt all buttoned up? What's going on? She knows
Must
there's
have been
something.
scary. Yeah.
Yeah. So she comes around and immediately recognized what I'd done,
Mm-hmm,
and I, you know, I made a very bad excuse. I got brushed by a branch, and but she didn't buy any of that. And so she went outside and called my brother, the brother of mine who lives in the same city as I do. At the time, I was very angry at her for doing that. Embarrassment and shame,
sure.
and didn't wish for it to be, so to speak, broadcast or shared. But her judgment was absolutely correct. My brother, two of them.
Mm-hmm. You still choke, huh?
Yeah.
Good. It's what makes us human, John. Do you have some water? Do you want to just breathe in and there you go, drink some water.
I think it might be. Um, um, the only person who I truly experienced unconditional love was my mother.
Hmm. And that was a big loss for you. Yeah.
But the next most important demonstration of unconditional love was what my brothers did,
Mm-hmm.
who um, without judgment or hesitation,
Mm-hmm.
did everything possible and then more to bail me out.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to say, but they did. It's hard to. It's an absolute fact they saved my life. That
I'm glad you had your brothers, and I'm glad you had your wife.
yeah,
And I hope that those who are listening, maybe this will help them reach out,
yeah,
because it is the hardest thing to do when you are in that amount of pain. You
yeah,
really believe you are a burden.
yeah,
You believe no one will listen or understand what you're going through because it's just so painful.
yeah.
I interviewed a while ago someone from the UK, and he told me, like you, he actually planned everything. And on the day of the attempt, all he wanted was, he said, I couldn't stop looking at my phone. And I was looking, he also wanted to jump from a place. And he got there, and he would look at his phone and he would think, 7 billion people in the world, nobody knows what I'm going
Mm,
through. My
yeah,
phone won't ring. But then he realized, I never reached out. Nobody knows. How
yeah,
can they possibly know? And that was a shift for him.
yeah. You probably know the work of Johann Hari,
Hmm. No.
um, JohannHairr. He's done a couple of TED Talks.
Mm-hmm.
He's an expert on um, let me recommend to your audience these 3 TED Talks.
Okay.
And the reason I bring it up at this time is that his work has helped him discover that the real cause of depression is the lack of human connection,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Yes.
what you're that person you're referring to is that's the underlying stimulus or the underlying motivation. Um, I'll call it stimulus for what causes depression is that
Mm-hmm.
the lack of connection emotionally and at a human level with other people, and that isolation is what drives people into depression.
Mm-hmm.
And
And it's also a symptom of depression. So it's really
yeah,
hard to get out of that space of isolation.
it's a loop.
It's a loop, but it is so important that you try and make an effort to reach out.
The healthiest thing you can do. It's a paradox, I know. Um, um, I think it was Ryan Holiday wrote a book called "The Obstacle Is the Way." And that's the
Mm-hmm.
point that he makes. The very thing that you're avoiding, or the thing that is the biggest obstacle for you, is in fact the pathway to your freedom or the pathway to the relief that you're seeking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
there is a saying in our area of mental health, and I can never find the first person who said this, but I think it just encapsulates what you just said. It's, we get hurt by relationships and we get healed by them.
mm, that's a new phrase for me, but that's in fact the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely, both ends of that.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully some of what I'm sharing today is another example of the wisdom of what you've just described. The connection my brothers made and my wife made. And
And it's so important what you're saying, John, because in the society that we live in today, we want quick fixes for everything. So
mm,
when we talk about depression, the first thing people say is take a pill, go to a
yeah,
doctor, which may be the case. And I am one of them. I did treatment for depression. I did take medication for a while. I've been fine since then. I didn't have to take it for very long. And it was very helpful, but it's not what really cures you. What cures you
no.
are relationships.
What I've learned is that this may be controversial, but what I've learned is there's very little known about what causes and heals depression,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a bunch of theories. One of which is medication, and there's 4 different, primary. You know more about this than I do,
Mm-hmm.
of antidepressants, and they kind of just give you a cocktail until they find the one that works for you. I had 3 or 4 different versions until this one seemed to be fine. I take them today. My mother suffered from mental illness, and in her situation, she was given medication that caused her to just almost totally shut down. Twice she's tried to remove herself from medication, and both occasions she had a relapse. And so my fear is that might happen to me, and so I don't want to find out. I'll just take medicine.
Don't. If there is one thing I can suggest, never do that, because it's really, really dangerous. And as you said, it is a tricky thing. It does take a while, but it does work many, many times. It helped me a lot. Right. I tried many things until I tried medication, and it did help, but I also did other things. It wasn't just medication, but just to say that the human connection is key when it comes to any emotional pain.
Yeah, I took therapy for a year weekly after that, and I also had a psychiatrist for a period of time, and there's value in that. It helps. Actually, is a place where going to therapy is the one place where you can absolutely speak what's on your mind without reservation or hesitation or concern about judgment. And if there's, which is a really important thing for me, because I live in a world where there's lots of judgment, and it's part of the reason I don't share very well.
Well, can you tell me about the Heads Up Guys initiative that you are part of? Because I saw that video and I was so interested in it.
It's a group attached to the university here, University of BC. The TED Talk we've been talking about, or the TEDx talk, has been touched a lot of people. One of those people is the sponsor of the Heads Up org, and they reached out to me and asked me to get involved with the group, and so that's how I came to be part of it. And they had that public service announcement they were putting together, and they wanted someone to represent a certain sort demographic, exactly, the guy wearing the suit coat and the sort of glasses and things, and so I was that guy. It's an organization that primarily is aimed at men who, like me, are experiencing mental health difficulties and who are reluctant or unwilling to reach out and to get help. And so it's the aim of that group to provide a resource to make it accessible, to take some of the stigma or some of the barriers, the speed bumps that it can that people can feel about getting help.
Yeah, and especially for men, because you guys, you get it really hard when you're growing up. You're supposed to suck it up, not cry, and be a man, and all these ideas of being a man means.
Yes, I had a warped view of that for a long time. What does it mean to be a man? But you're conditioned that way, and that's what, we've been talking about stigma, but you're conditioned that you should be some model of like John Wayne or something, and that's what it means to be a man. And any kind of demonstration of emotion or vulnerability is seen as deemed to be a weakness, and it took me a long time to figure out that, in fact, a lot of people are wrong about that.
Hopefully that's changing a little bit with the new generations.
I think it is. What I can tell you is that I get approached a lot, both on YouTube, and people find my contact details, and a lot of people reach out to talk to me about something that's helped them about that. And so what I mean by that is that more and more people are willing to take the chance to reach out and see if there might be a connection. And so I think it is changing.
Good. John, just to end our interview, our conversation, can you tell me what you have learned from this experience of sharing your mental illness and sharing about your suicide attempt. And also, what would you say to someone who is listening to my podcast now and who is struggling with that?
Well, some of what we've already talked about, but what I would reinforce is that as difficult as it may feel today, if you're willing to take the chance, reach out, get help, and it can and will get better. What I would say is that your ability to make a judgment about that while in the state of depression is at its absolute poorest place to make a good judgment about that. And that's part of the irony or the paradox, is that when you need help the most, you're in the worst position to make that judgment. The other thing is if at the time that I went to a hospital a little later, and a nurse said to me, well, you're lucky to be alive. And at the time I was angry at her because I didn't feel
Didn't
that
feel
way.
lucky, yeah.
No, I didn't. But today, I'll happily tell you that I'm lucky to be alive. Life hasn't been better. It's been the best 5-year period of my life. And so I hope that that can be the same for your listeners, that that if my experience is anything to go by, they too can have that experience as well if they're willing to step into it and take a chance and get help before it gets to a tragic place like it did for me.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your openness.
Pleasure.
For being vulnerable. I'm sure that Brené Brown would be very happy with this if she ever sees it. The vulnerable place that we're all trying to get there, and she helps us with that. I love her. I love her work. Yeah.
She's brilliant as a TED speaker. So let me recommend her talk on vulnerability. And it was only after that I did the TED talk that I saw her talk on vulnerability, and I was just gobsmacking to me.
So I wish I could have seen that a while ago.
Exactly. It just helped close the loop on so many things that I got to see the lessons or see the wisdom of what she was advocating.
Yes, and I will make sure that all the TED Talks that you mentioned, I'll have them on my notes and also on my website, understandsuicide.com, because I have the notes there. And I usually have more information and also how you can be reached. If you want, where can they see you?
I'm easy to be found. If you Google my last name, I promise it'll come up.
Yeah, if you know how to spell it.
Yeah, it's hard
Good
to
luck
spell
with that.
Sure.
But don't worry, I'll have it on my notes.
John at W5 Coaching, John at W5Coaching.com, or W5 Coaching is the website, and you can contact me. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, and you're very approachable. You're so quick to reply to me. I'm so thankful for that, and thankful for your participation and being here with us today.
I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to be part of it, Paula.